The fluorescent lights of the Pentagon briefing room cast harsh shadows across the faces of 12 senior military officers. It was February 28, 1985, exactly 40 years after one of the most audacious rescue missions in American military history. Colonel James Patterson stood at the podium, a yellowed file folder in his hands, preparing to brief the next generation of Special Operations commanders on a mission that military historians still studied with equal parts admiration and disbelief. "Gentlemen," Patterson began, his voice carrying the weight of someone about to reveal a closely guarded secret, "what I'm about to share with you is a case study in why we should never underestimate unconventional warfare techniques. This is the story of Private Jack Mercer, a meat packer from Chicago who accomplished what an entire platoon couldn't. And he did it with 6 throwing knives." A few officers exchanged skeptical glances. In 1985, Special Operations meant high-tech equipment, advanced training facilities, and cutting-edge weaponry. The idea of throwing knives seemed almost medieval. Patterson noticed their reactions and smiled slightly. "I see some of you are already doubting." His own commanding officers had the same reaction. Let me take you back to March 1945, to a moment when the impossible became reality. The war room in the 69th Infantry Division's temporary headquarters was cramped, filled with the smell of cigarette smoke and stale coffee. Maps covered every available surface, marked with red and blue positions that shifted daily as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany. Captain Robert Morrison stood over a reconnaissance photograph, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. Intelligence Officer Lieutenant Davies pointed to the grainy image. "This is the compound, sir. 5 miles east of our current position. SS-operated holding facility. Our sources confirm 23 Allied prisoners are being held in this barracks here." His finger tapped a small rectangular building in the center of the photograph. "What's the guard strength?" Morrison asked, though he already knew the answer would be bad news. 8 confirmed. Possibly more inside. All SS, all experienced. They rotate every 30 minutes, which means they're disciplined and alert. Davies pulled out another photograph. This was taken yesterday at 1400 hours. You can see the prisoners being moved from the main barracks to this isolation building. Morrison studied the image. Even through the poor quality of the aerial photograph, he could see the skeletal frames of men who'd been starved and beaten. Some were being carried by others. What's the execution timeline? March 18, 0600 hours. 3 days from now. The SS is clearing out all evidence before we advance. These men are on the list because they either attempted escape or were suspected of sabotage activities within the camps. The room fell silent. Everyone understood what those words meant. These weren't just prisoners of war. They were marked men, witnesses to atrocities that the SS wanted permanently silenced. Sergeant Miller, a veteran of the North Africa campaign, spoke up from the back of the room. "Sir, we could send in a platoon. Fast assault, overwhelming force. Get in, get them out. Across 5 miles of open farmland." Morrison shook his head. "They'd see us coming from 2 miles away. By the time we reached the compound, those prisoners would be dead. The SS would execute them the moment they knew we were coming." "Artillery strike," someone suggested. "And kill everyone inside?" "No. We need surgical precision here." Morrison lit another cigarette, his third in the past hour. "We need someone who can get in silent, eliminate the guards without raising an alarm, and extract those men before anyone knows what happened." Lieutenant Davies cleared his throat. "Sir, with all due respect, what you're describing is effectively impossible. 1 man against 8 trained guards, across open ground, with no support. The odds of success are 5%, Morrison interrupted. "I know. I've done the math. But those men are dead anyway if we don't try something." The door to the war room opened, and Private Jack Mercer walked in, summoned by a runner who'd found him cleaning his rifle by the supply truck. He stood at attention, confusion evident on his face. At 23 years old, Jack was lean and wiry, with calloused hands that spoke of hard labor long before the army. His uniform was worn but clean, and on his hip hung a leather bandolier that his squad mates had long since stopped mocking. Private Mercer, Morrison acknowledged him. At ease. Tell me about those knives you carry. Jack's confusion deepened. Sir. The throwing knives. Your squad calls you Blade. I've seen you practice. You hit targets at 50 feet with regularity. Where'd you learn that? Jack glanced around the room, suddenly aware that 12 sets of eyes were studying him with varying degrees of interest and skepticism. Chicago Stockyards, sir. Worked the bone line at Swift and Company for 5 years before the war. During lunch breaks, we'd throw knives at wooden posts. Started as a way to pass time, became a competition. Money changed hands based on accuracy. 50 feet consistently. Morrison pressed. 60 on a good day, sir. 70 if there's no wind. Morrison gestured to the reconnaissance photographs spread across the table. Come look at this. Jack approached, his eyes scanning the aerial images. He'd never seen photographs like these before, the compound from above, guard positions marked, distances calculated. 8 guards, Morrison said quietly. 23 prisoners. Execution scheduled for dawn in 3 days. The compound is surrounded by open farmland. Any conventional assault would be detected long before we reached the perimeter. The prisoners would be killed immediately. Jack studied the photographs, his mind automatically calculating distances, angles, sight lines. Years of throwing knives at moving targets in the stockyards had trained him to assess environments quickly. How far from cover to the compound perimeter? 200 yards to the fence line. Nearest staging area would be a small tree line here. Morrison pointed to a dark patch at the edge of one photograph. Guard rotation pattern. Lieutenant Davies pulled out a chart. Every 30 minutes like clockwork. 2 guards at the barracks entrance, 2 at the main gate, 4 on roaming patrol. They're disciplined, probably veterans. Jack continued studying the images, his fingers unconsciously moving as if feeling the weight of a knife. The room watched him in silence. Finally, he straightened up. I can do this, sir. Sergeant Miller barked out a short laugh. Mercer, this isn't the stockyards. Those are armed SS guards, not wooden fence posts. I understand that, Sergeant. Jack's voice remained steady. But the principle is the same. Distance, wind calculation, target assessment, execution. I've been doing this since I was 16. I know what I'm capable of. Morrison studied him carefully. Private, let me be very clear about what this mission entails. You would approach alone, across open ground, in darkness. You'd need to eliminate 8 guards silently, and I mean absolutely silently. 1 gunshot, 1 shout, 1 alarm, and those prisoners die. You miss a throw, you die. You make noise, everyone dies. You'd be extracting 23 weakened men across 5 miles of enemy territory with no support until you reached our lines. Yes, sir. I understand. Why? Morrison's question was simple but heavy. Why would you volunteer for what amounts to a suicide mission? Jack looked down at the photographs again, at the grainy images of skeletal prisoners being herded between buildings. He thought of the stories he'd heard from liberated camps, the mass graves, the systematic murder. He thought of Thompson, his platoon's medic, captured during the Battle of the Bulge. They didn't know which camp held him, didn't know if he was alive or dead. Every camp they liberated might be the one where they'd find him. Someone has to try, sir, Jack said finally. And I'm the only one who can do it silent. The room erupted in arguments. Half the officers thought it was suicide, a waste of a soldier's life on a mission with almost no chance of success. The other half recognized that it might be the only option that didn't guarantee the prisoners' deaths. Morrison raised his hand for silence. "Private Mercer, step outside for a moment." Jack saluted and left the room. For the next 20 minutes, he stood in the corridor, listening to muffled voices argue behind the door. He used the time to flex his throwing hand, feeling the familiar ache in his forearm muscles. 5 years in the stockyards had built strength specifically suited for repetitive throwing motions. The Army had only refined what Chicago had already taught him. When the door finally opened, Morrison's face was unreadable. "Private, the mission is approved with conditions. You have 48 hours to study every detail of that compound, guard patterns, approach routes, extraction paths. Intelligence will provide updated reconnaissance every 6 hours. You'll demonstrate your throwing accuracy for a board of officers tomorrow at 0800. If conditions change, if guard strength increases, if weather compromises the approach, the mission aborts." "Understood?" "Yes, sir." "One more thing." Morrison's voice dropped lower. "If you're captured, the SS won't treat you like a regular POW. What you're attempting, an assassination mission behind enemy lines, they'll consider you a terrorist. The consequences will be severe." "Understood, sir." Morrison handed him the file folder containing all reconnaissance materials. 48 hours, Mercer. Use them well. The demonstration range was set up in a cleared field behind the division headquarters. Word had spread through the camp that Private Mercer was going to throw knives for a board of senior officers, and soldiers had gathered at a respectful distance to watch. Jack stood at one end of the range, his 6 throwing knives laid out on a canvas cloth. Each blade was 12 inches long, weighted and balanced specifically for his throwing style. He'd commissioned them from a Belgian knife maker 3 months earlier, trading a week's worth of cigarette rations for the custom work. Captain Morrison stood with 5 other officers, all looking skeptical. "Private Mercer, you'll engage 6 targets at varying distances, 40 feet, 50 feet, 60 feet, and 70 feet. 2 targets at 70. All targets are head-sized circles representing kill zones on a human silhouette. You'll throw in sequence with no more than 5 seconds between throws. Any questions?" "No, sir." "Proceed when ready." Jack picked up his first knife, feeling its familiar weight. The blade was cold in the March morning air. He'd woken at 0500 to practice, loosening his muscles, getting his arm warm. Now, with dozens of eyes watching, he focused on the first target, a 40-foot throw, relatively easy. The knife left his hand with a practiced motion. 1.5 rotations. It struck dead center in the target circle with a solid thunk. No pause. Second knife. 50 feet. 2 rotations. Center mass. Third knife. 60 feet. 2.5 rotations. Center mass. The watching soldiers had gone silent. Even the skeptical officers were leaning forward now. Fourth knife. 70 feet. This was the edge of his reliable range. The blade needed to complete 3 full rotations with precise velocity. Too hard and it would hit pommel first. Too soft and it wouldn't penetrate. The knife turned through the air, catching morning sunlight. It struck the target slightly left of center, still a kill shot, but not perfect. Fifth knife. 70 feet again. Jack adjusted his throw by a fraction, compensating for what he'd learned from the previous attempt. This one struck dead center. Sixth knife. 70 feet, third target. Perfect throw. Perfect impact. 6 knives, 6 hits, all within kill zones. The entire demonstration had taken less than 30 seconds. The watching soldiers erupted in cheers. The officers exchanged looks that ranged from impressed to stunned. Morrison walked to the targets, examining each knife's placement. When he returned, his expression was carefully neutral. "That's impressive accuracy, Private. But targets don't move. Targets don't wear heavy coats that might deflect a blade. Targets don't turn at the last second. Yes, sir. That's why I aim for the spine, throat, or eye socket, areas where clothing doesn't provide protection and where a hit means instant incapacitation. A man with a severed spine can't shout. A man with a knife in his throat can't raise an alarm. I'm not trying to kill slowly, sir. I'm trying to kill silently. Lieutenant Davies spoke up. What about wind? Those photographs show the compound is in open farmland. There'll be crosswinds. I adjust for wind the same way a sniper does, sir. I read it, calculate compensation, and adjust my throw angle. I've practiced in wind, rain, and snow. Chicago winters taught me that. Another officer asked, what if you miss? What if a blade hits at the wrong angle and doesn't penetrate? Then I've failed, sir, and everyone dies. That's why I don't miss. Jack's voice carried no bravado, just simple certainty. I've thrown knives over 10,000 times in the past 8 years. I know my range, I know my limits, and I know what I can accomplish. This mission is within those limits. Morrison made his decision. The demonstration is approved. Private Mercer, you have 36 hours remaining. Make them count. Jack spent every waking hour studying the compound. Intelligence provided updated photographs every 6 hours, and he memorized every detail. The fence posts were 4 feet apart. The guard tower was elevated by 8 feet. The barracks door opened outward. The main gate was 12 feet wide. More importantly, he studied the guards themselves. Their patrol patterns were clockwork precise, exactly 30 minutes per rotation. But humans weren't machines. He noticed that the guards at the main gate talked to each other frequently. The roaming patrol guards walked with less alertness, suggesting they considered interior duty safer. The barracks guards stood close to the door, probably to stay out of the wind. These observations would matter. A distracted guard was easier to approach. A cold guard stamping his feet had predictable movement patterns. Guards who talked to each other had divided attention. Lieutenant Davies brought him the latest intelligence at 1,400 hours. Updated guard roster. We've identified 6 of the 8 by name from intercepted communications. All SS, all veterans of Eastern Front service. These aren't green recruits, Mercer. Good, Jack said, surprising the officer. Veterans follow patterns. They trust routine. Routine is predictable. You sound confident. I am, sir. But I'm also realistic. I know the margins here are razor thin. Everything has to go perfectly, or it goes to hell immediately. There's no middle ground. That evening, Jack wrote a letter to his mother. 3 sentences, sealed in an envelope he handed to Captain Morrison with instructions to mail it only if he didn't return. The chaplain found him cleaning his knives by lamplight at 2,100 hours. Private, I'm offering confession and prayer to anyone participating in tomorrow's operations. Thank you, Father, but I'm not Catholic. I'm not just offering Catholic services, son. A moment of spiritual preparation can help any man facing danger. Jack considered this, then shook his head. I appreciate it, but I need to focus on the practical right now. If there's a God, he'll understand I'm trying to save lives. That's prayer enough. The chaplain nodded and extended his hand. Then let me simply wish you good luck and Godspeed, Private. They shook hands. The chaplain left. Jack returned to his knives, checking each edge with his thumb, feeling for any imperfection that might affect flight characteristics. These 6 blades represented the difference between life and death for 23 men. They had to be perfect. Jack gathered his gear with methodical precision. The 6 knives went into his bandolier. Wire cutters for the fence. Dark clothing treated with mud to eliminate shine. A compass. 1 canteen of water. No rifle, no grenades, nothing that could make noise if dropped. His squad gathered around him. These were men he trained with, fought beside, trusted with his life. Now they watched him prepare for a mission where they couldn't follow. Private Coleman, who'd lost 2 fingers to frostbite at Bastogne, handed him a chocolate bar. Extra energy, Blade. Bring those boys home. Sergeant Miller, who'd mocked his knives 6 months ago, gripped his shoulder. I was wrong about the circus act comment. You're the real deal. Make it back, hear me? Jack nodded, tucking the chocolate into his pocket. See you for breakfast. Damn right you will. Captain Morrison was waiting by the jeep that would take Jack to the staging area. As Jack approached, Morrison handed him a folded piece of paper. Write to your family, just in case. Jack had already done this, but he took the paper anyway, scribbled 3 sentences, sealed it, and handed it back. Morrison read the envelope address, Mrs. Margaret Mercer, Chicago, Illinois, and tucked it into his jacket pocket. Intelligence confirms the execution is still scheduled for 0600 hours. You insert at 0200, which gives you 4 hours to neutralize guards, free prisoners, and reach our lines. 4 hours is tight. 4 hours is plenty, sir. Private Mercer. Morrison paused, choosing his words carefully. I have to ask one more time. Are you absolutely certain about this mission? Jack looked toward the east, where darkness concealed the compound and the 23 men waiting for dawn and death. Those men are counting on someone, Captain. Might as well be me. Morrison extended his hand. They shook. Bring them home, Blade. At 0100 hours, the jeep dropped Jack at a coordinates 2 miles from the compound. The driver, a corporal from Alabama, looked at him with something like awe. Good hunting, Private. Jack nodded and disappeared into the darkness. The March night was brutally cold, hovering just above freezing. Jack's breath formed small clouds as he crawled through the frozen farmland toward the tree line that would serve as his final staging point. The ground was hard as concrete, making silent movement difficult. Every shift of weight, every drag of his elbow, had to be calculated to avoid noise. He moved in short bursts, 10 feet, pause, scan for reaction, 10 more feet, pause again. The tree line was 400 yards from his insertion point. It took him an hour to cover the distance. At 0245, he reached the trees and allowed himself 30 seconds of rest. His hands were already numb from the cold and the crawling. He flexed them repeatedly, forcing blood back into his fingers. Without feeling in his hands, he couldn't throw accurately. Without accuracy, everyone died. From his position in the trees, Jack could see the compound clearly. 8 guards visible, just as intelligence had reported. 2 at the barracks entrance, standing close together, probably talking. 2 at the main gate, 1 smoking a cigarette. 4 on patrol circuits that brought them past various points along the fence line at predictable intervals. He spent 15 minutes watching, confirming the patrol pattern matched what he'd memorized. The rotations were clockwork precise, 30 minutes exactly, then all guards shifted positions simultaneously. The SS was nothing if not disciplined. At 0300 hours, Jack began his final approach. From the tree line to the compound fence was 200 yards of open ground, frozen farmland with no cover except darkness and a shallow irrigation ditch that ran roughly toward his target. He chose the ditch despite the freezing water. Better to be cold and concealed than warm and visible. The water soaked through his uniform in seconds, a shocking cold that drove the breath from his lungs. Jack gritted his teeth and kept moving, pulling himself through the ditch inch by inch. The smell of mud mixed with the distant coal smoke from the guard stations. His fingers went completely numb within 10 minutes. He had to stop twice to restore circulation, pressing his hands under his armpits, flexing them until feeling returned. Each stop cost him precious minutes, but throwing with numb hands wasn't just dangerous, it was impossible. At 0315, a guard approached the ditch to relieve himself. Jack froze completely, pressed against the muddy bank, water lapping at his chin. The guard was less than 20 feet away, close enough that Jack could hear him humming a German folk song. Urine splashed into the ditch just yards from Jack's position. The guard finished, buttoned his trousers, and walked back toward the compound. Jack waited a full minute before resuming his crawl, his heart hammering against his ribs. By 03:45, he'd covered 150 yards. 50 remained to the fence line, but the ditch ended 30 yards short. The final approach would be across open ground with no concealment except darkness. Jack studied the guard positions one more time. The nearest sentry stood 48 feet away on the other side of the fence. He'd measured the distance using fence posts as reference points. The guard faced partially away, rifle slung over his shoulder, hands shoved in his pockets against the cold. This was it. The moment of commitment. Jack drew his first knife, the blade cold and heavy in his hand. He flexed his fingers one final time, forcing blood into his fingertips. The throw would need to be perfect, 48 feet through a slight crosswind, hitting a target who might move at any moment. He rose into a crouch, water streaming from his uniform. The guard remained facing away, oblivious. Jack calculated distance, wind, rotation. 2.5 turns for this distance. Strike point, base of the skull where the spine meets the brain stem. Instant incapacitation. His arm came back. The motion was automatic after 10,000 practice throws, weight shift from back foot to front, arm extension, wrist snap, release at the exact moment when velocity and angle aligned perfectly. The knife turned 2.5 through the night air. It struck the guard exactly where Jack had aimed. The man's knees buckled immediately. He dropped like a puppet with cut strings, crumpling to the frozen ground without a sound. Jack was already moving, crossing the remaining distance in a low sprint. He caught the falling rifle before it clattered against the ground, eased it down silently, and dragged the body into shadows beside the fence. 1 down. 7 to go. He retrieved his knife, wiping the blade clean on the dead guard's uniform. The man had been young, maybe 20 years old. A photograph tucked in his jacket pocket showed a blonde girl smiling at the camera. Jack looked away and focused on the next target. Guard number 2 walked a patrol route along the western fence. Jack tracked him from behind a supply shed, calculating the approach. 52 feet away. The guard maintained a steady pace, rifle at port arms, more alert than the first had been. But alert meant predictable. The guard's eyes scanned in a pattern, left, center, right, center, repeat. His patrol brought him past a wooden post every 90 seconds. For 3 seconds, that post would conceal his body if he fell. Jack waited for the pattern to repeat. The guard reached the post. Jack threw. The knife caught him in the throat, severing the carotid artery. Blood sprayed across frozen ground, but the man made no sound except a wet gurgle. He dropped behind the post exactly as Jack had calculated. Jack crossed the distance, pulled the body fully into concealment, retrieved his knife. 2 down. 6 remaining. The next challenge presented a serious problem. 2 guards stood at the compound gate, positioned 15 feet apart, both facing the interior. Killing one would immediately alert the other. Jack needed to drop both nearly simultaneously, but repositioning between throws would create a delay of at least 3 seconds, far too long. He circled the compound perimeter, staying in shadows, until he found a better angle from the northeast corner. From this position, both guards were visible in profile, separated by 18 feet. If he moved to a spot exactly between them, he could reduce repositioning time. But it would require throwing from 65 feet, longer than he'd ever attempted in combat conditions. Jack positioned himself carefully, 2 knives in hand now. The guards were talking quietly, their attention on each other rather than their surroundings. They expected no trouble in the middle of nowhere, miles from active combat. Jack took a deep breath, calculating throw sequences. First guard, chest shot from 65 feet. The second guard would hear the first man fall. Jack would have perhaps 2 seconds before the second guard fully processed what happened and reacted. 2 knives in sequence. Trust the first would drop his target quietly enough. Release the second before confirmation. He threw the first knife. 1.2 seconds of flight time at 65 feet. It struck the guard's chest just left of center, piercing through to the heart. The man gasped, stumbled backward, began to fall. Jack was already releasing the second knife. It caught the second guard in the throat as he turned toward the sound of his companion's collapse. Both men went down within 3 seconds of each other. Jack sprinted to them, breathing hard despite the cold. 4 down. 4 remaining. But now he had a problem, 2 bodies near the main gate, visible to anyone who looked in that direction. The next guard rotation was in 7 minutes. He dragged both bodies behind the guardhouse, working quickly despite exhaustion. Sweat froze on his face in the March cold. His throwing arm ached from the repeated exertion and the cold. He had 3 knives remaining and 4 guards to eliminate. The mathematics were clear, he'd need to recover at least 1 knife before the mission ended, or he'd have to find another method for the final guard. Guard number 5 walked a patrol route between the barracks and the eastern fence. Jack tracked him from beside a water barrel, waiting for the right moment. 40 feet away. Moving in a predictable pattern. Back turned. Jack threw. The knife struck between the shoulder blades, severing the spinal column. The guard stumbled forward, made a strangled sound, fell. Jack was on him in seconds, clamping a hand over the man's mouth until the struggling ceased. 5 down. 3 guards remaining. 2 knives left. He retrieved his knife and assessed the remaining threats. 2 guards stood near the barracks entrance where the prisoners were held. The final guard walked a wide patrol circuit around the entire compound. The tactical decision was clear: eliminate the roving guard first with a knife, then deal with the 2 stationary guards using the fallen guard's rifle as a club. Gunfire would alert nearby units, but a rifle to the skull would be silent if executed properly. Jack positioned himself along the patrol route, hidden behind a stack of firewood. The guard approached, more alert than the others had been. Perhaps he'd noticed that check-in calls weren't being answered. Perhaps he simply had better instincts. 50 feet. 45 feet. 40 feet. Jack waited until the guard's attention focused on the barracks, then threw his second-to-last knife. It struck the side of the neck, severing the carotid artery. Blood sprayed across frozen ground. The man clawed at his throat, stumbling sideways, but made no sound except wet choking. He collapsed near the fence line. 6 down. 2 remaining. 1 knife left. Jack picked up the dead guard's rifle, checked that it was loaded, then ejected all the rounds silently. A loaded rifle created too much temptation to fire. He needed this weapon for impact only. The final 2 guards stood 30 feet apart near the barracks entrance, both facing the door. They appeared more alert now, perhaps sensing that something was wrong. The scheduled check-in from the other guards was overdue. Jack studied them from behind the firewood stack, 40 feet away. He had 1 knife and 1 rifle. 2 targets. The knife could drop 1 silently, but the second guard would hear the first man fall. Jack needed to close the 40-foot distance fast enough to reach the second guard before he could shout or fire his weapon. 4 seconds to cover 40 feet if he sprinted. Would that be fast enough? It would have to be. Jack gripped his final knife. His throwing arm was exhausted, trembling from cold and repeated exertion. He flexed his hand twice, forcing steadiness. The guard on the left stood in profile, offering a clear target to the temple. Instant death, no sound. Jack measured the distance 1 final time, adjusted for a slight crosswind, and threw. The knife struck perfectly. The guard dropped instantly. Jack was already running, boots pounding frozen ground, rifle raised like a baseball bat. The second guard turned, mouth opening to shout, hand reaching for his weapon. Jack covered the final 10 feet in 2 seconds and swung the rifle with every ounce of strength he had left. The wooden stock connected with the guard's jaw. Bone cracked audibly. The man went down hard, unconscious before he hit the ground. Jack stood over him, breathing hard, rifle ready to strike again if needed. The guard didn't move. 8 guards down. 23 prisoners waited inside the barracks. The execution was scheduled to begin in less than 2 hours. Jack tried the barracks door. Locked. He searched the fallen guards for keys, found them on the second body, and unlocked the door. Inside, 23 men stared at him from the darkness. They'd been awake, waiting for dawn and death. Some sat on bare bunks. Others stood by the windows. All were emaciated, hollow-eyed, wearing thin prison uniforms inadequate for the March cold. Several showed signs of recent beatings, split lips, blackened eyes, bandaged hands. "I'm Private Jack Mercer, 69th Infantry Division," Jack whispered. "We're leaving. Now. Stay quiet, stay together, do exactly what I say." For a moment, no one moved. Then a British lieutenant, Jack could tell by the accent, spoke first. "The guards? All 8. Dead. We've got maybe 15 minutes before someone notices they're not reporting in. Can everyone here walk?" The British lieutenant did a quick assessment. 3 can't. Malnutrition, beatings. They're too weak. Then we carry them. Pair up, strong men with weak. We head due west across the farmland toward Allied lines. 3 miles. No talking unless I signal. If we encounter patrols, you drop flat and don't move until I say. Understood? 23 heads nodded in unison. Let's move. The first quarter-mile passed in tense silence. The freed prisoners moved like ghosts through the darkness, boots careful on frozen ground. Jack led them away from roads, cutting across open farmland using his compass bearing to navigate. The March cold was brutal on men wearing only thin prison uniforms. Within 5 minutes, several were shivering violently. Jack distributed what extra clothing he had. His jacket went to a prisoner who was coughing blood. His gloves went to another whose hands were wrapped in bloodied rags. 3 men couldn't walk on their own. Stronger prisoners carried them in rotation, switching every few minutes to distribute the burden. It slowed them down, but leaving anyone behind wasn't an option. At 0430 hours, 30 minutes into their escape, searchlights erupted behind them. Sirens wailed from the compound. Someone had discovered the bodies. Jack heard shouting in German, then the distinct sound of vehicles starting. Dogs began barking. "Move faster," he ordered, his voice carrying urgency but not panic. "They know we're gone. Double time, but stay together." The column picked up pace. Men who'd been struggling to walk suddenly found energy born from pure survival instinct. The 3 who couldn't walk were carried by rotating teams of 4, passing the burden every 60 seconds. Jack pushed them hard, across a frozen creek that soaked boots and turned feet numb, through a small woodlot that provided temporary concealment, across another open field. Behind them, vehicle lights swept across the countryside like predatory eyes. German voices shouted orders. The dogs were getting closer. "There's a ravine ahead," Jack called back. "Drainage ditch, about 6 feet deep. When we reach it, everyone goes down. It'll give us cover and a route west." They found the ravine 3 minutes later, a natural drainage cut that ran roughly in the direction they needed. It wasn't pleasant, knee-deep in icy water, muddy banks, barely wide enough for single file, but it offered concealment. "Down. Everyone down. Move in single file. Keep your heads below the bank level." The prisoners slid into the ravine. They moved through it like a train of desperate men, boots splashing through icy water, hands braced against dirt walls for balance. A bullet cracked overhead, then another. The Germans had spotted their trail. Jack stayed at the rear of the column, watching their back trail. Vehicle lights were perhaps 400 yards behind now, closing fast. "Keep moving," he urged. "Don't stop. Don't look back." The ravine provided cover for nearly a mile before it ended abruptly at a small paved road. Jack risked a glance back. The vehicle lights were perhaps 300 yards behind now, maybe less. Dogs barked excitedly, they had the scent. Across the road, a dense pine forest offered the next cover point. But crossing meant exposure, 40 yards of open ground in full view of pursuers. "Everyone listen," Jack said quickly, gathering the group. "Across that road is forest. Dense pines. Once we're in there, they'll have a much harder time tracking us. But we have to cross 40 yards of open ground to reach it. When I say run, you run as fast as you can. Don't stop if someone falls, keep going to the trees. I'll help anyone who needs it. Ready?" 23 men nodded, faces grim with determination. "Run. Now. Go." The prisoners broke from the ravine and sprinted across the road. 3 men carried the weakest prisoners between them. Others ran with the stumbling gait of exhausted, starved men who refused to quit. Machine gun fire erupted from behind them. Bullets struck the road surface, throwing sparks. Jack heard the distinctive crack of rounds passing close. A tree on the far side exploded in splinters as a burst struck it. One man fell halfway across the road, the British lieutenant who'd spoken first in the barracks. Jack grabbed him, hauled him upright, and pushed him toward the trees. "Move." The tree line was 20 yards away. 15. 10. More machine gun fire. Jack felt something tug at his sleeve, a round passing close enough to tear fabric. 5 yards. He dove into the forest as bullets snapped past his head, rolled, came up running, and grabbed the nearest prisoner to pull him deeper into cover. "Count off," he ordered, his breath coming in hard gasps. The British lieutenant moved down the line, checking faces even though some were barely visible in the darkness. 23. All present. Keep moving. West. Use the trees for cover. Stay spread out so one burst can't hit multiple people. They moved through the pine forest at a stumbling run. The trees offered concealment and broke up sight lines, but the Germans were close behind now, moving with dogs, flashlights, and organized determination. At 0515 hours, dawn was less than an hour away. Jack recognized landmarks from his briefing maps. They were roughly halfway to Allied lines, but pursuit was organized and closing. Then he heard it, the sound of running water. The river, the boundary between German-held territory and the American advance positions. They broke through the tree line and found themselves on a riverbank. The water was 40 feet wide, running fast with snowmelt, far too deep and swift for the weakened prisoners to swim across safely. Allied lines were on the far side. Safety. Survival. Home. But the river might as well have been an ocean for men in their condition. Jack searched the riverbank desperately. There, a massive tree had fallen during a recent storm, bridging part of the gap. It didn't reach all the way across, but it extended 30 feet into the river. A strong man might be able to jump the final gap or swim the remainder. Across the log, Jack ordered. One at a time. Steady and slow. Don't rush. Don't look down. Just focus on your feet and the person in front of you. The British lieutenant went first, balancing carefully on the slick bark. He made it across the log, then had to swim the final 10 feet through numbingly cold water. He dragged himself onto the far bank and turned to help the next man. One by one, the prisoners crossed. Some moved with careful precision. Others crawled on hands and knees, too weak or afraid to walk upright. The strongest men helped the weakest, supporting them, encouraging them. The sounds of pursuit grew louder. Voices. Dogs. The snap of branches as men moved through the forest behind them. 18 prisoners across. 19. 20. The last prisoner was halfway across the log when German soldiers emerged from the tree line 50 yards away. An officer shouted for them to halt. Rifles came up. Jack grabbed a fallen branch and hurled it at the closest soldier, creating a moment of confusion. Go. Move. The last prisoner scrambled across and dove off the log into the water. Jack jumped after him, his boots hitting the icy river like a hammer blow. The current grabbed him immediately, pulling him downstream. He fought against it, swimming hard for the far bank. Gunfire erupted behind him. Bullets struck the water around him, creating small geysers. He reached the shallows and clawed his way up the muddy bank. American voices shouted from defensive positions ahead. Identify yourselves. Private Mercer, 69th Infantry, with 23 freed prisoners. Get your asses over here. We've got you covered. Jack and the freed prisoners stumbled into American lines at 0545 hours, 15 minutes before their scheduled execution time. Medics rushed forward immediately. A captain radioed confirmation of the successful extraction. Behind them, German forces held their position on the far riverbank but didn't attempt to cross. The prisoners collapsed in groups, some crying, some silent, all alive. Jack sat against a tree, his throwing arm hanging useless at his side. Every muscle in his body screamed. His uniform was soaked, torn, muddy. He'd used the last of his adrenaline getting them across that river. But 23 men were breathing. 23 men would see another sunrise. Captain Morrison appeared 20 minutes later, arriving in a jeep with a driver and a medic. He looked at the 23 prisoners receiving medical attention, then at Jack. Private Mercer, Morrison said quietly. Intelligence gave you a 5% chance of success. Guess I got lucky, sir. Lucky? Morrison shook his head slowly. Son, you just did the impossible. 8 guards eliminated with 8 knives. 23 prisoners extracted without a single casualty. That's not luck. That's skill. Jack nodded but didn't respond. He was watching the freed prisoners, watching medics wrap them in blankets, give them water, check their injuries. These men would go home. They'd see their families again. Some would have children, grandchildren, entire lives ahead of them. All because a meat packer from Chicago could throw knives accurately. The debriefing took 6 hours over 2 days. Jack recounted every detail multiple times, the approach, each guard elimination technique, the extraction route, the river crossing. Intelligence officers took extensive notes. The British lieutenant corroborated everything, adding his own observations. He moved like a ghost, the lieutenant testified. Never saw anything like it. Dropped those guards before they knew anyone was there. Silent, efficient, professional. Those men were veterans, experienced SS troops. Didn't matter. Private Mercer was better. A medic examined the 3 prisoners who'd been too weak to walk during the extraction. Severe malnutrition, multiple contusions, possible internal injuries. Another week in captivity and they likely wouldn't have survived. The execution would have been a mercy compared to what they were enduring. The after-action report, dated March 19, 1945, documented the mission's success in clinical military language: 8 enemy combatants neutralized without firearms. 23 Allied prisoners liberated without friendly casualties. Mission parameters met within designated 4-hour operational window. But it was the recommendation for Distinguished Service Cross that told the real story, for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy. Private John R. Mercer voluntarily undertook a mission of extreme danger to rescue Allied prisoners condemned to execution. Working alone and without fire support, Private Mercer infiltrated a secure enemy compound, eliminated 8 armed guards using unconventional weapons, freed 23 prisoners, and successfully extracted them to friendly lines while under pursuit. Private Mercer's actions demonstrated exceptional skill, unwavering courage, and absolute devotion to duty, reflecting the highest credit upon himself and the United States Army. The citation moved up the chain of command with unusual speed. Witness statements came from all 23 freed prisoners. Physical evidence included Jack's throwing knives, recovered from the compound by a follow-up patrol. German radio intercepts described the incident as a silent attack by unknown special forces. 6 weeks later, Captain Morrison assembled the company for a special formation. Jack stood at attention while Morrison read the citation aloud. When the captain pinned the Distinguished Service Cross to his uniform, America's second highest military decoration for valor, the entire company saluted. The freed prisoners wrote letters that trickled back over the following months. Private Mercer saved my life with a throwing knife. I watched him drop those guards from distances I wouldn't have believed possible. He never missed. Not once. Sergeant William Hammond, U.S. Army, Ohio. We'd accepted we were going to die that morning. Made our peace with it. Then this American appears like a ghost and kills 8 guards with knives. Thought I was hallucinating from hunger. Corporal Thomas Brighton, British Army, Manchester. I owe Private Mercer everything, my life, my future, the chance to go home and see my family again. There aren't words sufficient to express that debt. Lieutenant James Rothschild, U.S. Army, Virginia. The mission became a case study. Special operations units across the military studied Jack's approach, analyzing the planning, execution, and extraction. The German after-action reports, captured after the war ended, described the compound attack as surgically precise and professionally executed. Success rates for similar rescue missions improved. Training programs incorporated lessons from Jack's mission. Unconventional warfare doctrine expanded to include specialized skill sets that individual soldiers might possess. But Jack Mercer never sought recognition. When the war ended in May 1945, he returned to Chicago and went back to Swift and Company. Back to the boning lines. Back to a life measured in shifts and paychecks. He married Helen O'Connor, a girl from the Bridgeport neighborhood, in 1946. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. He rarely spoke about the war. When his children asked about the medal in his desk drawer, he'd show them and say simply, "It represents 23 men who got to go home." His old platoon held reunions every 5 years. Jack attended most of them. Men would inevitably ask him to tell the knife story. He'd deflect, redirect the conversation to the freed prisoners, ask about their families and their lives. "Those 23 men deserve to go home," he'd say. "I just opened the door." Several of the freed prisoners stayed in contact. Christmas cards arrived annually from Ohio, Manchester, Boston, Virginia, and other places. Brief notes, thinking of you. Still grateful. Hope your family is well. In 1967, 12 of the freed prisoners organized a reunion in Washington, D.C. They invited Jack, paying his airfare when he hesitated about the cost. They gathered at a restaurant, older men now but still bound by that March night in 1945. They shared dinner, told stories, laughed about survival and the absurdity of war. They toasted absent friends. 11 of the original 23 had passed away in the intervening years. A photograph from that evening shows Jack surrounded by older men, all smiling, all alive because a meat packer from Chicago could throw knives with perfect accuracy. Jack worked at the stockyards until 1973, when the Chicago meat packing industry collapsed and the plants closed. He took a job teaching shop class at a South Side high school, stayed there until retirement in 1985. His students sometimes noticed the medal in his desk drawer. He'd show it to them if asked, explain what the Distinguished Service Cross meant, tell them it represented lives saved rather than enemies killed. War makes people do extraordinary things, he'd tell them. Sometimes those things involve violence. But the goal is always to preserve life where you can, to bring people home. Don't forget that part. He died in 1994 at age 73, peacefully at home in Chicago. Heart failure. Helen was holding his hand. His funeral drew over 200 people. 8 of the freed prisoners attended, old men themselves now, some in wheelchairs, some using canes, but they came. They formed an honor guard at his casket, standing in the March cold just as they had 50 years earlier. The British lieutenant, now 81, spoke at the service. Jack Mercer showed me what one determined man can accomplish when he refuses to accept impossible odds. He saved my life with a throwing knife in the darkness. I've been grateful every single day since. Jack was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. His medals, the Distinguished Service Cross, the Purple Heart, campaign ribbons, were donated to the U.S. Army Infantry Museum at Fort Benning. His 6 throwing knives, the blades that had changed the course of 23 lives, were given to his children. One was later donated to Fort Benning and now hangs in a display case with a plaque describing the mission. The knife shows signs of heavy use, the edge honed sharp by countless practice throws in Chicago stockyards and Georgia training grounds. A small placard reads, "Throwing knife used by Private Jack Mercer, 69th Infantry Division, March 1945. 8 enemy guards eliminated. 23 Allied prisoners freed. 0 friendly casualties. Of the 23 freed prisoners, all survived the war. For return to military service, eventually retiring as senior NCOs or officers. 19 went home to civilian life, working jobs, raising families, growing old in the peace their generation had fought to secure. Every March 18th, those who were able would call each other. A tradition that continued for decades. They'd remember the night a meat packer from Chicago appeared in the darkness with throwing knives and impossible courage. They'd remember the guards falling silently, the desperate run across frozen farmland, the icy river crossing, the moment they reached American lines and realized they were actually going to survive. As they aged and their numbers dwindled, the calls became more precious. The last of the freed prisoners, Sergeant William Hammond, died in 2018 at age 94. His final March 18 phone call was to Jack's daughter, thanking her once again for what her father had done. A new generation of Special Forces candidates stood in front of the display case containing Jack Mercer's throwing knife. Their instructor, a master sergeant with 20 years of service, gestured to the blade. This knife represents a principle that's as relevant today as it was in 1945, unconventional problems sometimes require unconventional solutions. Private Mercer's commanding officers initially mocked his throwing knives. Called them obsolete. Said they belonged in a circus, not combat. The instructor paused, letting that sink in. 8 guards died to those obsolete knives. 23 prisoners lived because one soldier had the courage to trust his unconventional skills when conventional approaches had failed. One of the candidates raised his hand. "Sir, would a mission like that even be approved today?" "That's the wrong question, soldier. The right question is, do you have the moral courage to volunteer for a mission with a 5% success rate because it's the only chance 23 people have? Do you have the discipline to spend 5 years perfecting a skill that everyone tells you is useless? Do you have the confidence to trust your abilities when the stakes are life and death?" The instructor gestured back to the knife. Private Mercer wasn't superhuman. He was a meat packer who could throw knives accurately. But he had the vision to see how that skill could be applied, the courage to volunteer when no one else would, and the discipline to execute perfectly when failure meant death. The candidate studied the knife in silence. "That's what we're trying to teach you here," the instructor continued. "Not just tactics and weapons handling. We're teaching you to recognize your unique capabilities, to have the courage to employ them when conventional methods fail, and to execute with the precision that saves lives." One candidate spoke up, "Did Private Mercer ever write about the mission? Leave any record of his thought process? Just his debriefing reports. They're clinical, technical. He described it like you'd describe butchering a side of beef: distance, angle, technique, results. No drama, no heroics. Just the job that needed doing." "What about after the war?" He went back to Chicago. Worked in a slaughterhouse, then taught shop class. Raised a family. Normal life. When people asked him about the mission, he'd redirect to talking about the freed prisoners, what they did with the lives he'd helped save. He never saw himself as the hero of the story. The instructor checked his watch. Alright, that's enough history for today. Ranger training evolution starts in 15 minutes. Let's move. As the candidates filed out, several glanced back at the knife one more time. A 12-inch blade, worn from use, still sharp after 80 years. It had ended 8 lives and saved 23 others, all in one impossible night. In the final analysis, Jack Mercer's mission succeeded because of 3 factors. Perfect preparation. He spent 48 hours memorizing every detail of the compound, guard positions, patrol patterns, distances, angles. He practiced until his throwing motion was automatic. He planned for contingencies. When he ran low on knives, he adapted by using a rifle as a club. Unconventional expertise. 5 years in Chicago stockyards had given him a skill set the Army hadn't specifically trained for. But it was exactly what the mission required: silent elimination at range without firearms. Absolute commitment. He volunteered for a mission with a 5% success rate because 23 men needed someone to try. He executed with precision when failure meant death for everyone. Military historians study the mission not because it was typical, it was anything but because it demonstrated principles that remain relevant. Unconventional problems sometimes require unconventional solutions. Individual expertise can be adapted for tactical application. Perfect execution of a high-risk plan can succeed where conventional approaches fail. Modern special operations doctrine includes case studies of Jack's mission, analyzing the planning process, the execution sequence, and the extraction under fire. The mission success rate, 100% guard elimination, 100% prisoner extraction, 0% friendly casualties, has never been replicated under similar circumstances. Jack Mercer accomplished something that remains almost unprecedented in military history: a solo infiltration, neutralization of 8 enemy combatants, liberation of 23 prisoners, and successful extraction to friendly lines, all without firing a single shot. The meat packer from Chicago who everyone said belonged in a circus instead proved that sometimes the most effective warriors aren't the ones with the most advanced training or the best equipment. Sometimes they're just ordinary people who've perfected an extraordinary skill and have the courage to employ it when everything is on the line.